I said, oh no, there's more rain.
More rain, did you say?
How are you two feeling? They had a bout with COVID, I'm afraid.
Oh yeah. That was a drag.
Yeah.
We're done. We're done.
Who got it first?
Eric.
Oh, so you got it from her.
Yeah. We got it from somebody who had attended a reunion for the Ballard High School graduating class of 1961. So we are now official Ballardites because we have the same COVID infection that all those high school people had.
Yeah, I was coming home from Hoco and stopped at Ed Carrier's down in Indianola for his 88th birthday, and my wife wasn't feeling good and tested positive. So we talked it over, and she told me to go back to Hoco. She didn't want to wear a mask all the time and be in a sick room. So I did. I went all the way back to Hoco, and her son, who lives in Olympia, took care of her every need. And then she became negative, and I could come home. But it's around. It's certainly here.
What a nice son.
What's that?
What a nice son.
Yeah.
Our kid stayed away.
Yeah, very nice. Okay, well, I'm gonna switch over here. Let me see. Okay, can
36 people.
That's
I'm
great.
gonna hit the share screen and get some business done before we can begin the program. And like I say, this is our 11th meeting. Let me see if this is this full screen or two or split? Can you see the title screen?
Yeah, it's full, Dale.
Oh, okay. And I want to thank Matt Barkley, our president. He's coming in and really is 9:30 in Indianapolis to help us. And we are recording this. But anyway, we have a great update tonight by Scott Williams. Like I say, this is his third talk to PNWAS on this topic. He's also, as mentioned, a stone tool expert and has done 3 stone workshops with us, and spoke about his master's work on these huge adzes that he did his research on from Hawaii, the Big Island. And anyway, he had quite the time the last couple of years in coming up with some actual evidence of parts of this shipwreck. It left the Manila. Let me see. I have to do a. No. Get a laser point going here. See, they left them in the Philippines, and this was going on for 100 or so years, couple hundred years. They took these galleons up and through the currents and hit the winds here and went across. Well, somehow they didn't make the corner here, and they ended up in Oregon here. Now we have some of the evidence for that, and he'll show you that. This is Scott last summer working with his crew from the back here, but they had quite a time getting these remains out of the rock shelter. You know you're big time when you're in Archaeology magazine from this issue, but from around the world you can see they pointed out this big discovery, which I should point out, and this is in your newsletter. It's sponsored by National Geographic, some of their work, which did a good write-up, and so did the Smithsonian magazine. So it's really very current news, and this is only the second presentation. He gave one in June, but it has a lot more information, so we're very fortunate. But these new clues came up from this Spanish shipwreck gathered from the Oregon coast. And they say near Manzanita. Where is that, Scott? I never heard that.
Manzanita. It's south of Cannon Beach.
Yeah. Okay. But it confirms that that dozens of timbers belong to the Spanish galleon Santo Cristo de Burgos, and this is in 1693, so very early history of our area, going from Manila to Mexico. Anyway, there's things that have been found before, but not actually parts of the ship. So this is a new part of this. That same issue, and you might have it, featured an interesting article on our work at Ozette. So it's still getting into the archaeology magazine. And if you missed the last couple of, or several talks, we had a very good one on the 23,000-year-old footprints, supposedly 2,300-year-old footprints found in New Mexico. And here's our YouTube channel. So it's worth going in there. David Bustow did a very good job. And we also have presentations that follow our Chehalis River hypothesis theme. Excellent talks by Dennis Jenkins and John Blog on Paisley Cave, and On Your Knees Cave by Jim Dixon, and Vic Casera, who's with us, gave a brilliant talk on his animated video. So you should watch his presentation in video on the Chehalis River hypothesis. Our last speaker was dynamite. It was Jennifer Raff from the University of Kansas. It also is on our YouTube. She agreed to let us record it. And she certainly believes that from the genetic research, people did first come down the coast, coastal people, and they moved very quickly across the coast and from genetic evidence, and probably worked their way this way very quickly as well. But a likely entrance is the Chehalis River. We had a wonderful camp out at the Macaw Days celebration. This is this year's Macaw Days celebration with all the salmon. Their Red Devil soccer team, I think, or maybe basketball, doing in the marches. Lots of kids this time with Matt Barkley's parent support group friends. And this is an old picture of Julia, but we did have two nice baked salmon, or we did have baked salmon this summer.
Yeah, Julian is 15 now, by the way.
I know. And he does.
That is an old picture.
But there's 44 people came this summer, so hopefully you can join us next summer and enjoy Macaw Days. The December talk, early winter, I'll be, or not early winter, but winter talk, I'll be giving a talk on wet sites and how they contribute so much to understand the other side of subsistence, the plant food part of the diet, where we've been finding millions of salal berries, very small berries at sites like Ozette, a very important food to dry and make into berry cakes and get you through the winter to have carbohydrates and sugar you need. And then we found Acorn leaching pits, over 100 of them down at Sunken Village, Sauvie Island, and Portland. The pits by volume, the water would go through the acorns that were in these lined pits and leach out the acid so that they were sweet and edible. But we measured the pits, and with 100 pits, you could have 2.5 million acorns being processed at once. So a major food source there, as well as in a site we dug in Olympia, Kukwas. We found, once we dug that site, we could actually see we had a lot of acorn shells at Mud Bay at Olympia. So it's an important part of finding out that other part of the diet. It's not just fish and shellfish, but you had to have your carbohydrates. And then our late winter talk is by a new doctorate from University of Calgary, and they found an 11,100-year-old submerged stone fish trap offshore, and this goes along with some of our query about how people were probably very active along the west coast following glacial times, and probably moved through this area on their way down the coast, or found their way down the coast. Well, let me introduce Scott here, Scott Williams. He's been involved with professional archaeology for at least 35 years. And he's certainly a specialist in multidisciplinary work in the Pacific Northwest, but also Oceania. Worked in Palau, Samoa, Mariana Islands, Hawaii, of course. He went, got his BA in Hawaii in archaeology, in the Marshall Islands in Australia. He currently works for the Washington Department of Transportation in Olympia, the head of the Cultural Resource program with 7 archaeologists and historians. And he's president of the Maritime Archaeological Society, a nonprofit that has worked on this project shipwreck project for some time, and he's asked me, we give him an honorarium of $200 to provide that to this nonprofit. So we appreciate that we can use it to support their ongoing work. And probably most important, he's on the board with us at the Pacific Northwest Archaeological Society. So we really appreciate the years of work you've done there. He went to Washington State University and got his MA in 1989 and got his BA, like I said, at University of Hawaii in 85. And he's also worked for the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, and also the U.S. Department of Agriculture as their Natural Resource Conservation Services archaeologist. He also was an adjunct faculty at the school I worked at for quite a while, 2003 to 2012 with South Puget Sound Community College. Numerous publications. One I particularly is with this group of papers on outreach in archaeology and how successful his Maritime Archaeological Society has been in reaching the public. So you might look into that. He might be able to tell you how you could get involved. And we had an article in there too of 36 years of outreach with the Pacific Northwest Archaeological Society. With others, he's published Archaeology of the Manila galleons in the Americas, and looking at the wrecks of several of these galleons in a major publication by Springer Publishing. He's also worked on Salish Sea Island archaeology and pre-contact history. And again, I really appreciate his work with us. 2004, he did a talk on the huge adze blades from the Big Island in Hawaii. And he again did workshops in 2006, 2011, 2013, flint knapping workshops. We could have him, ask him to do that again at some point. And but 4 times, 2008, 14 years ago, he talked about finding the Beeswax shipwreck with us, 2008, and then in 2019. So for these seven PNWAS presentations, he's actually, with our 36 years, he's been involved with 20% presentation years. And and he didn't even come to this area till 15 years after we started PNWAS in 1985. So we really appreciate his outreach. So with that, I'd like to introduce to you Scott, and he'll have a real update on what they are finding with this new discovery. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Dale. I'm going to share my screen here. And as Dale said, I think I gave the first talk on this for PNWAS in 2008. I've been working on this project since 2006. But this last summer, we actually had a really exciting find, which is mostly what I'm going to focus on tonight. So I'm going to talk about the wreck of the Santo Cristo de Burgos. It's been known as the Beeswax Wreck in Oregon for almost 200 years. And I'll talk about why it's called the Beeswax Wreck and how we know it's actually the galleon Santo Cristo de Burgos. Let's see. Hang on, Dale, I just got to, oh, there we go. Okay. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the wreck, I'm going to run through just a little bit of background stuff before I get to the findings of this summer and the newest finds that we've made. So if you've heard this part before, bear with me. I'll try to get through it pretty quick. So it's called the Beeswax Wreck. And as I said, it's been known about for almost 200 years. It actually was first recorded by fur traders in 1813. So the local Native Americans have known about the shipwreck, obviously, since the day it wrecked over 300 years ago. But the white settlers and fur traders and explorers have actually known about it since 1813. And they called it the Beeswax Wreck because it was carrying tons and tons of beeswax in these large molded blocks. And so this picture is a picture of one of those blocks that was found in the early 20th century. You can see it's got the number 67 inscribed on it. The block itself is weathered somewhat. So originally it would have been a perfectly rectangular block. And what really fascinated people about this shipwreck, besides all this beeswax, was that it was ancient. It predated the European exploration of the Northwest coast. So that got people really interested. What ancient ship would be carrying so much beeswax and why? So we started the Beeswax Rec Project back in 2006, and it's a nonprofit, it's a research project. I got involved with it because some friends of mine who were doing galleon research in Hawaii heard about the Beeswax Wreck, called me up and said, hey, can you help us with this shipwreck in Oregon? And I said, sure, who doesn't want to do shipwrecks, especially Spanish galleons? And I thought we were going to be working someplace warm like Mexico or Florida, and it turns out it's in Oregon. I'm not going to read this slide, but I just do want to point out this is a research project. We do all the work that we do with the full knowledge and the proper permits from the Oregon State Historic Preservation Office, Oregon State Parks, Oregon Department of State Lands. It's not a salvage, it's not a treasure hunt. These kinds of galleons weren't carrying a lot of treasure. So they're not like the galleons you hear about in Florida or Mexico that had, 50 tons of gold or 100 tons of silver. These galleons were carrying a different cargo. So even if we find the wreck tomorrow, we at the Maritime Archaeological Society don't get to keep any of it. It all goes to the state of Oregon, which is the legal owner of the wreck, the state of Oregon and the Kingdom of Spain. So just to orient you, we are on the, if you can see my cursor moving here, the North Oregon coast. This is the town of Manzanita in the Nehalem River. So we are south of Cannon Beach, north of Tillamook. And what I want you to see on this slide is the Nehalem River comes out of the mountains, flows, makes a 90-degree turn towards the ocean, and then another 90-degree turn before exiting into the ocean. This area here is the Nehalem Sandspit. So it's just a large sand spit between the river and the ocean. And as I tell you all these things, I'm going to run through and basically just start throwing, facts out to you. But those are facts built on 16 years of research. So this, how do we know what we know? And in this case, we have both written histories of the shipwreck from those early fur traders and the settlers and travelers to the area. And we have the Indian oral histories. And a lot of those oral histories were written down by the settlers and then by, for example, Smithsonian anthropologists coming to the Oregon coast in the 1870s. So we've got a lot of information. The issue is different people telling that information, different people writing it down over a period of 200 years. So some of those stories get kind of meshed and confused and details get dropped or added. So part of what we've done is try to sort through those stories, see where they match, where they don't match, what are the original basis for those stories? What are the oldest stories to start off with? So I mentioned the shipwreck is known as the Beeswax Wreck. These are some pictures of some of those beeswax blocks that have been found. You can see they have symbols carved into them, letters, designs. This block over here in the lower right has actually been in the ocean for a long period of time and has been eaten by burrowing organisms. That's why it has that odd shape. And this graphic in the upper left is some of the symbols that have been found on that beeswax over time. And that really confused the early settlers. I mean, first of all, they were confused there was beeswax. Second, they were confused there was so much of it. And then third, it had these strange symbols on it that they could kind of recognize, but they didn't make sense to them, other than one symbol that was on a lot of blocks, which was the Latin abbreviation for "in Jesus's name," IHS. In addition to beeswax, other parts of the ship were seen. And I should note, Dale, you had mentioned that no part of the wreck had ever been found. Actually, lots of parts of the shipwreck were found throughout the 18th century. Pieces of wood, the ribbing, the decking, the masts, part of the mast steps. So lots of pieces were found. Unfortunately, from what we could tell, all those pieces were either collected and burned as firewood or made into furniture and door frames and walking sticks and sold off. Some of it was apparently dumped back in the bay. So we don't have very many pieces of the actual shipwreck itself. And the wreck itself has not been seen either in the ocean or on land since the early 20th century. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are some of the other artifacts from the wreck. There are two wooden rigging blocks. The one in the upper right was actually cut off the shipwreck in 1896. And that's how good the preservation of this shipwreck was. That rigging block was still intact. The one in the lower right was found on the beach in 1992. And both of those have been radiocarbon dated. The wooden wheel in the lower left was found by a beachcomber in 2008, wedged into some rocks. And we haven't radiocarbon dated it, but it's teak wood, which many of the galleon pieces of wood are made out of teak. So we're pretty sure it's from the galleon. And then a couple of chest handles and a small oil jar from a Catholic priest's holy oil set. The other thing that's been washing up for, ever since the ship wrecked more than 300 years ago is Chinese porcelain. As you can see in these pictures, most of it is broken up. It has been smashed by the surf. It's little pieces, but it still has elements of the designs on it. The local Indians would take this porcelain and they would make it into arrowheads. It makes fantastic arrowheads and small scrapers. The Indians had no use for coffee cups or plates, and so the pieces that weren't broken up, they often broke up to make into porcelain tools. Now, as an archaeologist, this is the most exciting find from the shipwreck, this porcelain. The wood from the shipwreck has been radiocarbon dated, But if you know anything about radiocarbon dating, it's not a very precise dating method. Particularly, it's not a precise dating method for anything in the last 300 to 400 years. And that has to do a lot with changes in the radiocarbon curve, changes in atmospheric carbon, and just the precision of the dating technique. But porcelain is a luxury good. So porcelain, and by luxury good, I mean it's like cars or iPhones. It changes every few years with fashion. And so a porcelain expert can look at these broken bits of porcelain, look at the designs on them, these patterns, right, these patterns here, and they can narrow down the manufacturing date of the porcelain. It also helps that some of it, if you look here in the lower left, has Chinese characters on it. And through analyzing that porcelain, we could narrow down the shipwreck to happening between 1680 to 1700 AD. So that's a really tight date for a shipwreck. So all this evidence together tells us this wreck was a Manila galleon. These were large Spanish cargo ships built in Manila in the Philippines. And we know that because the Spanish were the only European powers, the only Asian powers that traded in large blocks of Filipino beeswax with Spanish shipping symbols. Now, the Chinese traded in beeswax, the Japanese traded in beeswax, but not in the volumes that were found on the Nehalem Spit, and certainly not with Spanish shipping symbols. And the porcelain that has been found, although it's made in China to be exported to New Spain, which is Mexico and South America. And we know that because we can see in the broken fragments that instead of vessels like teacups or rice bowls, which would be the things the Chinese would make to ship to Japan or Korea or other parts of Southeast Asia, the vessels were chocolate and coffee cups, hot chocolate and coffee cups, and plates and other decorative wares. And we also know that a single galleon explains all these finds. So over the 200 years that Europeans have been writing about the Beeswax Wreck, there have been people speculating that it was a Spanish supply ship, a Portuguese merchant, a Dutch pirate, an English pirate, specifically Francis Drake, a Chinese junk, or a Japanese junk. And some people have said, well, there must be multiple shipwrecks there because there's so much material. But we know, again, that these ships were so large that one galleon explains everything that has been found. And the galleon that wrecked here in Oregon, we're pretty sure was carrying almost 1,600 tons of cargo. So for 1693, that's a very large ship. And Dale mentioned this briefly, the Manila trade. This trade went on for 250 years. The Spanish, their only access to Asian luxury goods was through the Philippines. They had to sail across the Atlantic to Central America, cross Mexico or Panama, build ships in the Pacific, and they sailed them to Manila, where the Chinese merchants would come and bring goods. And then once a year, they would load up a very large ship and they would sail it back to Acapulco, Mexico. And they only sailed once a year. And that ship carried the entire year's worth of cargo for the colony in Manila. And Manila's only reason to exist was for this trade. So as you can imagine, the colony was very dependent on the trade. So if a ship went missing, the Spanish spent years searching for it. And to get back to Acapulco, they would leave Manila and they would have to, they would have to sail north up towards Japan and across the North Pacific. It was a horrendous voyage. In a good year, it took 6 months. Some years it took 7 or 8 or 9 months. So imagine being on a 150-foot long, 40-foot wide sailing ship with no refrigeration, no toilet facilities for 6 to 9 months with another 200 to 300 people on board. There are written historic accounts of these voyages, and they're just fascinating. They talk about how bad the food gets, how they had to try to catch rainwater because they never carried enough water on board because water took up space. So they relied on rainwater. They carried water, but not enough for the whole voyage because they could carry more cargo. The ship should have turned south about the latitude of Monterey Bay, California. For some reason, this ship went north, and we think it was pushed off course by a storm. They were not up here exploring. They weren't up here looking for new lands or harbors. They were very lost. And it wrecked here in Oregon. And it was so far off course that the Spanish never found it. So this is just a National Geographic painting of one of these galleons being loaded. I won't spend a lot of time on here, but this just kind of gives you a feel, I hope. It's a cutaway, but you can see all the cargo that was being stuffed in the hold. These ships were literally stuffed to the rafters. Most of the passengers and crew slept on deck or slept in very small cabins because they had so much cargo and provisions on board. And we know all this about the Spanish galleon and the Manila trade because the Spanish kept excellent records. They are still preserved in the National Archives of the Indies in Seville, Spain, millions of pages of documents detailing these galleons and their cargo, the crews, the trials and tribulations they ran into. And the Spanish did that for a purely bureaucratic reason. The king wanted his taxes and the merchants wanted insurance on their cargoes. So I always forget to tell people why the ship was carrying so much beeswax. So I've added this slide in. The beeswax was a minor cargo. Despite the fact that they were probably carrying 60 or 80 tons of it, it was a minor cargo on the ship. And by minor, I mean, it wasn't worth a lot of money. The ships were primarily carrying silk, cotton, and spices. Those were the big high value goods. Silk from Asia, cotton from India, spices from Asia, porcelain, and Asian luxury goods like carved ivory tusks and Japanese lacquerware. The beeswax was a utilitarian cargo, and it was meant for consumption in New Spain, in the New World. There were no native honeybees in the New World that made large enough hives to get a lot of wax from. So the modern honeybee we see in North and South America was introduced by the Europeans. So beeswax in the Philippines is very easy to come by. The giant Asian honeybee makes these large honeycombs, and the Catholic Church required beeswax candles in the church. The missions used beeswax candles. At least the wealthier people used beeswax candles. So the beeswax was utilitarian cargo. As archaeologists, its importance is it's durable, it floats, and it lasts. You know, by durable, I mean it can last buried in the sand or under the water for hundreds of years. And so we find so much of it, or at least the settlers found so much of it. We don't find so much anymore. So we knew it was a Spanish galleon. We knew it was a galleon from Manila, and we knew it was a galleon sailing from Manila to Acapulco, because as they were sailing from Manila to Acapulco, that's when they carried the beeswax and the porcelain. When they were sailing from Acapulco back to Manila, they were carrying passengers and silver. So this galleon we know was sailing east. Despite the galleons being a trade for 250 years, and despite a lot of them being lost, over 15% were lost due to storms, wrecks, pirates. But even with those numbers, only 4 of the eastbound galleons went missing without a trace. 2 of those galleons went missing in the 16th century and 2 right at the turn of 1700. We knew from the porcelain dates it had to be one of the later 2 galleons, 1693 or 1705. So the Santo Cristo de Burgos was lost in 1693. The San Francisco Javier was lost in 1705. So when we started this project back in 2007, when we started doing field work, we knew one of the unique things about the Pacific Northwest and the Oregon coast is we have giant mega earthquakes. And those earthquakes cause the coastline to drop, and they cause tsunamis, very large tsunamis, to wash in. So we assumed, okay, a tsunami would have wiped out the 1693 wreck, but the 1705 wreck, it would have wrecked onto the Nehalem Spit. And this is an aerial photograph of the Nehalem Spit in 1936. It would have wrecked onto this barren sand spit that had been lowered and washed partly away. So when the ship came drifting in, it would have run aground on this beach. And then over the 300 years, the sand would have built back up. So where the ship ran aground in, say, 1705 might now be under dry land. So as I said, this is the spit in 1936. You can see the river comes down. The spit is very barren. It's forested up here because these are older dunes that were above the elevation of the tsunami. And then the river comes out through these two jetties. The river mouth used to be this sandy area here at the lower right as well. The jetties were put in 1918. So here's what the spit looks like today. It's still essentially the same, except it has grown wider because in the 1950s, Oregon State Parks planted all that vegetation you can see. It's beach grass and Scotch broom. And those jetties caused the spit to expand. So that was another reason we thought, okay, a ship that ran aground in 1705, possibly here, is now under dry land. So we got a very sensitive metal detector and walked the entire spit up and down, looking for buried cannons or anchors. And we partnered with Portland State University to do ground penetrating radar over the spit. We were looking for old channels the ship might have gone into, and where the tsunami erosion beach was, which still shows in the radar. While we were doing that work, we saw all these water-worn cobbles. And Dale mentioned my day job is I'm an archaeologist for the Washington State Department of Transportation. So I know what old roads look like, and you don't make old roads out of water-rounded cobbles. So we realized these could be a tsunami feature, and we had students go out, we mapped out the spit, gridded it into 100 or 300 foot squares, and we sent students to each grid point and had them draw and record every rock they could find. And what that showed us was the spit had this, what's called a Cobble Drape deposit. That's what these round circles are. And they're sorted by size. The biggest boulders are right where the tsunami would have washed in and out of the river. Then they get smaller as you get towards the river mouth. And that was important for us because it showed us exactly what the level of the spit was when the tsunami went over it. And we were able to identify that beach. This is the picture. You can see the tsunami layer here. This dark sand is river sand and river cobbles dumped on the spit. This is all wind-blown sand above it. And here's the tsunami of 1100 AD beneath it. But while we were doing that work, Kurt Peterson, our geologist from Portland State University, as we were mapping out where historically shipwreck pieces had been found and beeswax was found, Kurt told us, you're shipwrecked before the tsunami. And we said, Kurt, that's impossible because the Santo Cristo de Burgos burned in the Western Pacific, according to the histories, and sank in the Western Pacific because there was a survivor who told the story. And Kurt said, I don't care what the history says. I'm telling you the geological facts say you're shipwrecked before the tsunami. So that caused us to go back to the archives where we found that the Santo Cristo de Burgos had not burned, in fact, in the Western Pacific. That story was made up and passed along by a Harvard historian who didn't do his fact checking. And we've been able to show that the ship did not burn in the Pacific and was totally lost. So we're pretty certain it's the one on the Oregon coast. But once we realized that a tsunami had scattered the wreckage all over the spit, we thought, okay, it's hard to find in the park because we'd have to take a bulldozer and dig a giant trench, which of course the park would not let us do. So we moved our search to offshore. We got a bunch of volunteers with boats and various gear. And our thought was, the tsunami probably left behind the lower hull of the ship. No cannons or anchors have ever been found. So we would go offshore and try to find those. We also knew that all the porcelain was washing ashore on the beaches. So something is still out there offshore. So this is a marine magnetometer, this yellow torpedo-looking device or bomb-looking device. It's an underwater metal detector. You tow it behind a boat. So we have started searching offshore. This is a crew of divers from the Maritime Archaeological Society. We have been hampered because we are a small nonprofit organization. We don't have large boats. We have to borrow boats from our members. To do safe underwater diving, we have to have at least 3 divers on any given day. So for a dive day to work for us, we have to have good weather, good ocean conditions, good visibility, a boat, and 3 divers. And sometimes those things don't all come together. I mentioned porcelain has been washing ashore. This is the north, just north of the Nehalem Spit. This is Nehalem, this is Neocony Mountain over to the right, over here, and Smuggler's Cove, and Arch Cape, Cape Falcon. This is Cape Falcon, this is Arch Cape over here. A lot of porcelain has been washing ashore at Smuggler's Cove. So we thought, okay, something has drifted or part of the ship broke up and is here offshore. So we've spent since 2011 doing underwater dives and magnetometer surveys and side scan sonar surveys out there. And I really have to give a shout out to this gentleman. This is my friend Craig Andes. Craig is a local fisherman in the Garibaldi area, fisherman, clammer. He's also just an avid historian, looking into or has been fascinated with his shipwreck and stories of the Neocony treasure since he was a kid. And Craig is one of the most knowledgeable people about where porcelain washes up, where other shipwreck artifacts wash up. Craig is the person who made the big discovery that I'm going to tell you about here in a second, of pieces of wood from the ship itself. So as I mentioned earlier, in the 19th and early 20th century, there was lots of pieces of the shipwreck, and unfortunately, none of those survive. So no wood has been seen, as far as we know, since the 1920s. There are reports of pieces of wood being seen in the 1950s, but if they're still somewhere in the park, they're deeply buried under all that vegetation. So Craig has been working with us since we started. A lot of that porcelain I showed you pictures of is from Craig. He's an avid beachcomber. And when he started seeing that porcelain, he started to collect it, knowing it was a clue to where the ship would be. So as I said, Craig and I have been working together for about 15 years now. He shares his finds with us, and then we go investigate them with the permits and the permission of Oregon State Parks and the State Historic Preservation Office. So in early 2020, Dale and I mentioned every February, the Maritime Archaeological Society has a Shipwreck Conference in Astoria, Oregon. In February of 2020, Craig showed up at the Shipwreck Conference and very excited told me he had found part of the Spanish galleon. And he'd found pieces of wood from the galleon exposed at low tide in some caves. And being president of the society, or vice president at that time, I was very busy with the conference. I looked at Craig's photos on his cell phone, and they weren't convincing to me. And the way he described, wooden timbers preserved and exposed at low tide, I told him, as an archaeologist, somebody who's done a lot of wet site archaeology work with Dale over the years, I said, Craig, there's no way 300-year-old ship timbers would survive in the intertidal zone. It's something else. So Craig said, you got to come down and look. So March 2020, the pandemic hit. So between March and July or August, or July of 2020, Craig was probably calling and texting me just about every week, say, I'm certain this is the galleon. You need to come down and look at it. And I said, Craig, you're out of your mind. I'm not traveling in a pandemic. There's no way it's the galleon. finally in July, I said, okay, Craig, I think you're wrong. Send me a couple of little pieces of wood. I don't care whether you find some loose pieces or cut a piece off what you think is a shipwreck piece. Send me a piece of wood. I will get it sent to a wood lab. And if it's a tropical hardwood, we'll talk. If it's Doug fir, Sitka spruce, stop. So Craig did. And I got the results back, and all 3 samples he sent me were tropical hardwood. And so I called Craig and said, Craig, I owe you an apology, and you can tell me I told you so for the rest of my life. I think you found something. If not the galleon, you found some kind of shipwreck. So these are some pictures Craig sent me of the wood beams. And you can see it's in a very rocky area. They're trapped under these large boulders, and there's just these water-rounded ends exposed. And Craig knows the area well enough to know that the beams were actually buried up until late 2019. They were buried in sand and gravel. That's what preserved them. Then something changed. The sand and gravel started eroding away. When Craig first saw these, he thought, oh, they're driftwood. But then he really took a good look and could tell that they were parts of a shipwreck. And being so interested in the galleon, he figured they were from the galleon. We weren't 100% sure at first, but I want to point out here, we're looking at a very large wooden beam trapped in one of these ocean caves. It's actually wedged in a fissure in the cave floor. And I have a close-up of that beam. So here you can see the beam. You can see the squared off side. It's eroded and water-rounded, but it's definitely been squared off. And once we got a really good look at it, some of these holes, and I'll show you more pictures, are actually iron spike holes. They're not caused by burrowing animals. So we radiocarbon dated the wood and got a date that was consistent with the Spanish shipwreck. And so in September of 2020, we went out, we mapped the site, we collected a few pieces, and we wrote a report for Oregon State Parks and the Oregon State Archaeologist. And we said, we really need to go recover this wood before it washes away. So we made plans to go back in the summer of 2021, and between trying to get permits from 4 different state agencies, trying to coordinate National Geographic because they helped the funding, and COVID, we weren't able to get out in 2021 until September. And by then it was too late to get the wood. So we put all the work on hold. We kept it quiet because we didn't want people to go out and basically take these pieces of wood. And let me tell you, it's very hard to sit on a find like this for a year and a half. But we kept it quiet, and we worked with National Geographic and the state agencies, and we went back out in June of 2022, so this last summer. And our goal was really to recover this big beam because it was the most diagnostic, and any other beams we could get. And this is an example of another beam. And you can see it doesn't look like much. It'd be easy to walk over if you were walking through a tide pool. It's very eroded, except this one has 3 spike holes still preserved in it. So we assembled a team. We had to assemble a team of archaeologists. We had law enforcement supporting us. We had the Nehalem Surf and Rescue Team supporting us. We had the Clatsop County High Angle Rescue Team supporting us. To get out to this site, you have to hike along the base of these sea cliffs at low tide. And you have to get out to the site, get the wood, and get back out before the tide comes back in, or you'll get trapped. So the sheriff's office was there to rescue us if we needed it. The Nehalem Surf and Rescue people were there, not only to rescue us, but to get these large beams back to the beach. So you can see behind me here, this is that large beam. And the picture is a little bit distorted in the perception. That beam is 7.5 feet long, 10 inches square, and weighs about 200 pounds. So we knew there was no way we were carrying that back to the beach. The Nehalem Surf and Rescue guys towed it back to the beach on jet skis. So you can see we wrapped it in life jackets. There's the jet ski behind us with their rescue board, and they towed it into the beach where we then loaded it into one of State Park's little trucks, a little quad, to carry it up off the beach to the parking lot and off to the Columbia River Maritime Museum. So this was really a huge effort and very unlike most archaeology projects I've been on. We had very limited time. We had to get what we could. Luckily, we had recorded it in the 2 years prior, its locations. And we had all this law enforcement support. So this is a picture of that large beam at the Columbia River Maritime Museum, kind of looking down on it. That's a spike hole. 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 One of these is a spike hole. That's another spike hole. And let me see, I think on my screen, I can't see it because it's under my picture here. There's a little bit of metal exposed in one end. So here's some of the other pieces of wood we recovered. You can see it's pretty water worn, but there are still just enough characteristics of some of the wood. So this was a large piece that Craig found. You can see this tape measure. This is almost 3 feet long. We think this is what's called a ship's knee. So picture a piece of wood that would support the deck. So it would have a flat top and a curve to it to support the overlying deck. And that's what this appears to be, one solid ship's knee. So there's enough pieces of wood. We recovered, I want to say, I'd have to go back to my notes, but about 8 diagnostic pieces of wood. We recovered over 25 pieces of wood, but some of those are very eroded and you can't really tell what they were, but about 8 that have either spike holes or shapes to them. And this is an X-ray of that large beam. So you guys get to see it here first. Here are 4 spike holes. These 2 still have the iron spike completely rusted away, but it left behind an iron crust in the spike hole. That's what these are. You can see these nice square holes. That shows us this is an old shipwreck. Modern ships use round bolts, not square bolts. Spanish and older ships, or the older ships, used square bolts. And then this other ghostly shadow to the right, that's the little bit of metal that's exposed at the surface of the wood, and you can see the spike tip running down into the wood. So I should also mention what's so exciting about this find is the Manila galleons, although they sailed for 250 years, and although there's a lot of archival material about the trade, there's very little material about the ships themselves, how they were built and what they were built out of. And there have only been 2 other Manila galleon wrecks that have been found where there was wood still left intact. So both of those wrecks were off in the Western Pacific. There are 2 other Manila galleon wrecks in North America. There's one in California and there's one in Baja, Mexico. Ours in Oregon is the only one where wood has been recovered. And so we're pretty excited. We have scanned, we've done laser scanning and LiDAR scanning of the all the pieces of wood. We've drawn them, we've measured them. We're shipping those out to various Spanish galleon experts to try to figure out which parts of the ship are represented by this wood. I'll also tell you one of the reasons the shipwreck wood preserved, we're just now starting to understand, is those large boulders that the shipwreck wood is trapped under. The wood was apparently sometime after the shipwreck was washing around there in the cove, probably carried up by the currents. And then when the mega quake struck in January of 1700, it caused a large rock slide on the cliff there. And that rock slide trapped these pieces of wood. So the coincidences are amazing. I should have mentioned earlier, one of the reasons so much beeswax has been found and so much shipwreck wood was found throughout the 19th and early 20th century is most nearshore shipwrecks, they wreck in the surf, they break up, and the ocean scatters them for dozens of miles, and you never find a single wreck. That started to happen to this ship, but these Manila galleons were so strongly built, the ship probably survived several years of being pounded by Oregon winter storms, started to break up, and then the tsunami came, picked up a lot of the wreckage and the cargo, and dumped it on dry land. It dumped it high enough, at a high enough elevation that the tides couldn't wash it away, storm waves couldn't wash it away, river floods couldn't wash it away, and it dumped it on a barren sand spit where the sand dunes migrate across the spit. So they bury shipwreck remains and they expose them. They bury them and they expose them. And that's how the settlers were able to find so much shipwreck wood and so much beeswax throughout the 19th and early 20th century. So we're super excited about this find. I'm still working on the report. We're still trying to figure out which parts of the ship are represented. Did the ship wreck here in the cove? Is this a chunk of the ship that drifted up to the cove? So we're still working on that. But we do know this would have been the first contact probably with Europeans on the Northwest coast, with the exception of Francis Drake coming through in 1578, I think is when Drake came through. But this ship, the Santo Cristo de Burgos, when she left Acapulco, was carrying 234 crew and passengers. We know there were survivors because the Indians tell us there were survivors. They have detailed oral histories of those survivors living with them for several months. Those survivors left descendants on the Northwest coast. And then at some point, a fight broke out. And there is a native story that was told to a Smithsonian anthropologist in 1878 that said the survivors resisted, throwing stones behind them and under their arms with great force, which I think is the Indians' way of saying the survivors fought with muskets. Because if you've never seen a musket and you get shot by one, that little lead ball is going to look like a stone thrown at you with great force. So it's been 16 years. We have finally, thanks to Craig, found part of the galleon. We're hoping to find more of it this coming summer. We will be out there with our boats and our divers. We have an underwater remote operated vehicle with a video camera. We have a brand new magnetometer. So we're going to see if we can locate either the anchors, the cannons, and we're going to dive offshore of where these timbers were found and see if there's any more out there in the water. We've also been working with Oregon State Parks as they develop Nehalem State Park, which we know there are shipwreck materials buried by the tsunami in the park. We'll work with them to help identify those. So I have talked your folks' ear off for 45 minutes or so. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and take questions. Okay. And feel free to
turn on your mics and feel free to ask questions.
I do have a sort of a trivial one, but I'm always bad with dates.
Okay.
So is this the same? Is this the tsunami caused by the earthquake that also buried Ozette?
The Ozette site, we're not sure. The dates are older at Ozette. It was buried by a mudslide. So the original thought, and Dale knows much more about Ozette than I do. The original thought was the mudslide buried Ozette prior to the earthquake. I'd love to relook at the radiocarbon dates because I wonder if the earthquake triggered that mudslide. But as you know, we get a lot of mudslides in the Pacific Northwest, so it wouldn't have to be triggered by the earthquake. But right now, the dates from Ozette are earlier. And then
Patrick, do you have any thoughts about the tsunami?
I was just typing a note to Scott. I was just asking him, what was Kurt Peterson's evidence that the ship wrecked before the tsunami? You
So-
mentioned Kurt's statement, but what was his evidence for
Yeah.
that?
So the evidence is the spit, the height of the spit is and where the shipwreck pieces were found was up to 25 feet above sea level.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so too high for even the largest storm waves, much too high for a flood
Right.
to have deposited it. And then also, as we went back through the historic accounts, Pat, those settlers who were looking for beeswax, there was so much beeswax on the spit, the settlers actually mined it. They prospected for it. And one of the ways they prospected for it is they would dig down in the sand until they found what they called a flood layer or a freshet layer of, twigs, sticks, logs, and the beeswax was in that layer. And we know now that was the tsunami layer, not
Wow.
a flood layer, because
Yeah.
the elevation is too high. And we also, Patrick, we were able to get an OSL date on that buried tsunami layer to date it to the 1700 tsunami.
Fantastic. Great story. Just a great
Thanks.
story. I have one factoid about the Ozette slide is that because some of you may know that I do dendrochronology, and that I was reading, I can't remember his first name. He just died this past year, a tree ring scientist named Josa, who was up in BC working at a consulting firm, but he was paid to do some consulting work. Maybe Scott, maybe Dale knows about this. He was paid to do on contract some consulting work, and I have the report, by the way, on Ozette in my files here. And as I recall, the pieces of wood that they looked at the tree rings of was in the late 1600s, was as close as they could get, but they didn't have any outer wood of any trees of a bark bearing tree that they could convincingly show was killed by the event. All they had was fragments of wood that I think possibly were used in the lodging at Ozette. Does that sound familiar to you, Dale?
Yeah, it was the wall planks. They were using the cedar wall
Yeah.
planks, which is pretty definitive, and they were I think I have that report too. They pretty much had to use densitometry, not the width of the rings, but the density because of the amount of rainfall in the area.
Yeah, the rings are pretty complacent over there. They don't really show the climate changes that much. And Joseph did do densitometry too. I know that. I know Ruth Kirk, rest in peace, Ruth. Ruth Kirk once told me you should relook at that and relook at the tree rings, but I haven't had time yet.
Yeah. I always thought the radiocarbon dates were kind of not fishy, just not well interpreted, given the problems of old wood.
Oh, you mean at Ozette?
At Ozette, yeah.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
radiocarbon dates that said the slide happened in like 1500 or 1550. If you think about old wood problems, there are metal artifacts at Ozette that were assumed to have come from Japanese junks, and they may have, or they may have come from this Spanish galleon. We know the Nehalem Indians were trading galleon cargo up and down the coast as soon as it wrecked.
Yeah. Wow.
I think we pretty well settled into that site, or that was earthquake, major earthquake that we all know may come again, but it was 1700 is what I remember, even with the tree ring dates. But there was an earlier one. There's an earlier house under another mudslide about 800 years old. But the one, it tended to come in, well, this site is really 300 years old, even though they always said it was 500. It was
Okay.
more, without
That
a
would
lot
make
of
sense.
supportive evidence.
Yeah.
And I don't
So-
know, it seems like the C14 dates aren't many and not well presented, like you say, but the
It's-
densitometry, like Patrick was saying, was curious because it wasn't exactly at 1700, but it was in that ballpark.
It's hard to date things in the last 300 years. I mean, that's an issue. We don't rely on radiocarbon dates for the shipwreck identification. And as I mentioned, it has a lot to do with the radiocarbon curve, the amount of radiocarbon the amount of radioactive carbon in the atmosphere over the last 300 years has really fluctuated, and it makes radiocarbon dating in that period very difficult. So about the best date you can get is 1650 to 1950. And you could sometimes narrow that down to the highest probability within that 300-year span of, 1650 to 1720, something like that. But you'll never get a date that's like, 1650 to 1680 or something like
Yeah,
that.
the only way to get a date like that would be using the wiggle match technique, which means you have to have a piece of wood with enough tree rings in it to
Yeah.
get separate dates separated by known number of tree rings. And then
Yep.
you best fit this whole array of
Yes.
dates to the decay curve. And then, you can either visually or using the computer software get a date. And that usually
Yeah.
makes the probability within a few decades, but you really have to have a lot of tree rings to do that.
Yes. Yeah. So Stanley, I see your question about was the ship armed with cannons and such? Would there have been gunners and at least one gunnery officer? So yes, in fact, there were 36 gunners on board. And we know that because another researcher, a woman by the name of Cameron La Follette, she went to she had a researcher go to the Spanish archives in Seville and translated the 900 plus pages of documents related to the Santo Cristo de Burgos. And all that information is reported in the Oregon Historical Quarterly in the summer 2018 special issue. They did a special issue on the Beeswax Wreck. But Cameron was able to find the complete crew and passenger manifest. So we know there were 36 gunners. We know their names. What I don't know is, does that mean the ship had 36 cannons and the gunners were like the gunnery officers and they had sailors to assist them? Or did a cannon have multiple gunners? I think it was the first, that each cannon had a gunner with sailors to assist him. So we know these galleons were armed. They were armed by order of the king, but we also know that the merchants didn't like all the space that the cannons took up. So they would store the cannons in the ballast, in the lower hold as ballast, because once they left the Philippines, the only times they were going to get attacked by pirates was in the Philippines or at Acapulco. Once they were in the open Pacific, there was no worry of pirates because the Pacific's just too darn big. So they would stash the cannons, and there are historical accounts of a galleon getting close to Acapulco and being jumped by an English pirate, and the English start shooting cannonballs at them, and it takes the Spanish several hours to get their cannons out of the hold and set up before they can start shooting back.
Well, the reason I asked that is, as you know, there's this Aboriginal legend of a Spanish incursion into the Okanagan and Smilkameen, and guys looking for gold and whatnot. And I've got a Métis individual I've been working with who's been out talking to the elders. They allege, that they've actually found the mound where these Spanish guys were buried. And it ties into that Sri Lankan sword that allegedly came out of the Penticton burial. So I don't particularly think that the Spanish incursion into southern BC was probable or possible. But
Stanley, when you and I had talked about this several years ago, I told you the same thing, that I really doubted it. But since then, I've had a Quinault friend of mine tell me that the Quinault have oral histories of Spanish slave raids on the North Washington coast prior to the British and the Americans coming here, and that his family has a Spanish shipwreck survivor in it. And when I was like, well, there's no written historical account of that, he said something very, very meaningful to me, which is, are you telling me I don't know my own history?
Yeah.
To which I had to say, wait, whoa, no, I'm not telling you that. And one thing I've learned in the 16 years I've worked on this project is, we have obviously a British history and American history bias. That's our culture. We
Mhm.
know very little about Spanish history. We know even less about Russian fur trade exploration. There was so much stuff happening on the Northwest coast that we know nothing about. And I say that because, now we know, well, this Spanish galleon wrecked there in 1693. But we also know from the North Oregon coastal histories, another Spanish ship wrecked sometime between 1720 and 1740. And there's good oral history evidence for that. There's genealogical evidence for that. There's no written European record of a Spanish ship up here between 1720 and 1740. We know a second Spanish ship, or a third, if you count the galleon as the first one, wrecked on the North Oregon coast sometime about 1770. And again, there's great oral history. There's great genealogical history. There's very sparse archaeological history, and there's no written history of it. But I think the Spanish in Mexico and South America were doing more up here that didn't get recorded than, or maybe it's still recorded somewhere in the archives in Seville and it's just never been translated. But our British/American history skews us. And that was one of the reasons I didn't mention it in the talk, but when all that beeswax was found by the end of the 19th century, despite the beeswax being found in molded blocks with letters and numbers carved into it, those molded blocks having melted candles in them, candles with wicks being found, beeswax blocks with bees inside them. By the late 19th century, people living outside of the Nehalem Manzanita area said there is so much wax there, it cannot be shipwreck wax. It is inconceivable. That's one of the quotes. It is inconceivable that an ancient ship could have carried so much wax, therefore it's mineral wax. And they actually started drilling for oil on the Nehalem Spit because they refused to believe that a non-British, non-American ship could be that big and could carry so much beeswax.
Scott, you have a question from Robert McClure here.
Okay, Robert. Where can we learn more about what happened to the survivors? Robert, if you go to the Oregon Historical Society's website, they have the 2018 journal available as a free download. It's a PDF file. That's the single best source to learn about the survivors and what likely happened to them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. I was gonna say I could put the link in the chat. I don't have it here. I'd have to go search for it, but go to the Oregon Historical Society website.
And you said it was 2018?
Yes, summer 2018. It's their journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly.
Got it. Thank you so much.
You bet. That's the single best source for everything on the Beeswax Wreck until I write my book, which is 10 years down the road. So go for the.
Thank you so much.
Other questions? Scott, is there any word from, say, like the Silettes or other tribes down there about survivors?
Yes, lots. And we've been working closely with the Silettes tribe and the Grand Ronde, both of whom are the federally recognized representatives of the Nehalem and Clatsop tribes. So yeah, there are quite a few oral histories of survivors and of family members who were shipwreck survivors. So yeah, I also forgot to mention, and I wanted to tell you folks here in PNWAS first, we're still waiting for the radiocarbon dates from the shipwreck beams that we recovered this last June, but we got the wood identification back on those beams. And the initial wood identification we had done through the USDA forestry lab in Wisconsin, and they came back and said, tropical hardwood, either from Asia or South America, because it was a huge family of trees. We sent samples from these last set of beams that we recovered to the Philippine National Forestry Laboratory. And they came back and said, these are definitely, they identified the wood to species. They are endemic species native to the Philippines. So it's, at first, as we were recovering the shipwreck pieces, we thought, okay, it's probably the galleon, but it could be a Japanese junk, or it could be one of those later Spanish wrecks. But those later Spanish wrecks were built in Mexico or South America. So the fact that this wood is from the Philippines tells me it is the 1693 galleon. I think that's the best evidence, much better than the radiocarbon dates, to tell us we found part of the galleon.
Further questions? I have, I just wanted to point out the Solettes might be able to help you with boats. I know they're very excited about what you're doing, and they got a 5% fund.
Oh yeah, with a boat, yeah.
too.
The
And
hardest
they've
thing
helped
for us,
in different projects, but you might look
yeah,
at
the-
getting
the-
Robert Kenta or Bud involved. And
the hardest thing for us is we're a small society, and if anyone wants to join, if you Google Maritime Archaeological Society, we're based out of Astoria, Oregon. It's maritimearchaeological.org. Our dues, I think, are $30 a year. You get a newsletter, you get to come to the Shipwreck Conference, and you get to volunteer on our projects. And we do projects besides the galleon, but our biggest issue, Dale, has been, we're a small group. It's finding volunteers who are available. Sometimes those good weather days are like on a Wednesday. So somebody has to be able to either take off work or has to be retired. Sometimes we'll set up a day to go diving or to go out on a boat and literally cancel that at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so if you're driving down from Seattle, you have to either spend the night or, leave Seattle at midnight to come down for the project. So that it hasn't been money so much. It's been having the bodies, the manpower to do the work.
we have other members on. I'm sorry he's not here, but Dale Fischel's been very excited and helping.
Yeah. Yep.
You-
Dale and I have talked a lot about it. So
Any other questions?
I was going to add, having said that bodies are our main issue, we're always happy to accept donations, and they are a tax write-off. So, because we're always needing money for boat fuel. We're trying to buy a new sonar. We got our magnetometer and we've got our ROV, but we'd like to buy a new sonar. So
We better up our honorarium a little. One thing I would ask was on this tons of beeswax, and I know it's for the church, it said, and missions. How much would that be? I mean, didn't they have a lot of silver mines they were trying to operate and gain, the wealth from the silver and the gold down there? You
Yes.
think they need candles to
probably
help them with the
that's
mining.
actually, yeah,
mining.
that's a very good point, Dale. Probably a lot of it also went into those silver mines.
I think they would say it's for the church, but I think
Yeah.
needed them to get some more silver and
Yes.
and
And
gold.
and it's interesting. It was the silver that fueled this trade. The only good,
That's
the only
still
commodity. Well, yeah, the only commodity that the Europeans had that the Chinese wanted was silver. The Chinese weren't interested in gold. They had their own large empire. They had gunpowder. They had paper. Silver was their most highly valued item, and the Spanish happened to be sitting on the world's largest silver mines, and so. Most of Spain's economy, most of Spain's wealth went to Asia, and Spanish economists at the time complained about, we are bleeding the country dry for Asian knickknacks and luxury goods. So sound familiar?
Yeah. And the Spanish were quite involved in supporting that Veterans Park in Nia Bay because of their fort,
Yeah.
which didn't last long, and they probably do have some relatives. that
Yeah.
had
Yeah, only 6
from
months,
that
I think.
encounter. But
Yeah.
I know the king that the Spanish government gave him $80,000 towards that reconstruction of
Yeah.
that Spanish fort in Nia Bay. And
Yeah, and we've been in touch with the Spanish government about this shipwreck. National Geographic has been a huge supporter. There's a private archaeology firm called Search Incorporated. They've been a huge supporter of us. So yeah, we've gotten a lot of good support over the years. Like I said, we could always use more. So please don't think I'm saying don't send money, but you know, if you need a good tax write-off, we'll take anything you want.
We really didn't find much historic materials at the Ozette site, but it sounds like the Spanish may have been dropping, as well as shipwrecks from Asia, materials into the area, and you know, not unintentionally, but
Right.
and traded in. But we really didn't. We find certainly iron.
Yeah. And we know there were Japanese junks washing ashore from about 1636 up to 1856.
Oh.
There were social and political reasons why Japanese junks went drifting in the Pacific. And they're all Japanese junks, by the way. There are no Chinese junks on the West Coast.
Yeah, they had pretty massive ships.
Yeah.
The Chinese, but they probably didn't get lost too often.
Well, they had better ships than the Japanese, so they were less likely to get dismasted and de-ruddered and wind up drifting in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Japanese junks were not built for open ocean travel. So they'd get caught in typhoons off the east coast of Japan. They'd lose their masts and their rudders, and they would be swept into the North Pacific Current, which is why we have so many Japanese junks washing up between Alaska and Mexico.
And
Or had.
maybe survivors from your galleon too. I mean, they
Yep.
typically were, if allowed to live, were taken as slaves, had to agree
Yep.
to be owned and slaves, and that's so that, I mean, they may not have had a lot of influence.
No, probably not. But we know from the later Spanish wrecks that there were survivors who married into, you know, first were taken in as slaves, but married into native families.
Right, and they probably were marrying slaves. I mean, in
Yeah.
the general course of things.
And generally they were Spanish survivors who had a useful skill like blacksmithing, gun making, gunsmithing.
Yeah. Other questions? We probably have time for one or two.
Well, we've kept people on for almost 2 hours. So thank you all for staying.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Scott, for being so available to us at PNWAS for various reasons and various outreach programs.
You bet.
We're really, you know, we're really excited that this has turned. I mean, you've been very persistent. If you say 16 years, and it's paid off, and certainly being acknowledged.
Yeah, and I really,
what's that?
I was just going to say, I really should say, you know, this is not my research. I'm the public face of a large group of people like Craig, the guy who founded the Maritime Archaeological Society. There have been so many archaeologists, students, historians, community members, tribal members involved in this. I'm just the guy who kind of pulls the pieces together and talks about it. But really the work is being done by a huge group of people, and a lot of the most important work, like finding the wood, mapping the site, collecting the wood, has been done by my colleagues and friends, not by me. I was out for the wood collection, mostly, you know, yelling at people, you go grab that, you grab that. We have to go, the tide's coming. That was my main job.
Well, we're lucky that, and they're lucky that, you know, you have these skills that you are more
That I like to talk.
help us with public outreach and explain this. And this probably the first big overview talk you've given. So
This is, you guys heard first the latest results. They haven't been written up yet. So keep an eye out. We'll get something out in writing, but probably not till December at the rate we're going.
yeah, and he has a very busy day job.
Yes, that's why I said not till December.
Well, thanks so much, and we look forward to seeing everybody. The again, the next talk, I'll get out a newsletter on the work we've been doing with looking at flora from these wet sites to give us that other side of subsistence in the past. We know so much about the fauna because that's what they tend to get in most sites, but the flora is going to be very important from wet sites. Any other last comments for the order? But thanks, Matt. It must be really late there.
Oh.
And if he's still there, and enjoy your time with your
Yeah.
grandmother.
Could
He's
probably stop recording too.
an amazing president. Takes good care of this